Ladies and gentlemen, as much as I hate cutting off great dialogue and bonding, we might move on, particularly after you're all energised now after that low-calorie, no-sugar, gluten-free morning tea we've all just enjoyed. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Janet Hunt, presenter for the second paper today. Dr. Hunt is author of the issues paper, Engaging with Indigenous Australia, Exploring the Conditions for Effective Relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Communities. Dr. Hunt is a fellow at the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research, or CAPER, at the ANU. After a long career in international development, followed by senior lecturing positions in international development at Deakin and RMIT universities, Dr. Hunt moved into the field of Indigenous Australian development. Dr. Hunt relocated to CAPER to manage the Indigenous Community Governance Project 2004-2008, which was a major national study of governance in Indigenous communities. Since then, she has continued her research interests in Indigenous governance and engagement and community development, while researching Indigenous engagement in natural resource management in New South Wales. She also teaches postgraduate courses in Australian Indigenous development. Please welcome Dr. Hunt.
Well, thank you very much, Wayne, for that introduction. I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the country, the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And in doing so, I'd also like to thank Songwama Maruchi for her very warm welcome to this country. And I'd also like to thank the Clearinghouse for the opportunity that they gave me to do this research and to present the findings here today. And it does fit very well with what Fran just presented before morning tea. So what I'm going to do is tell you about the literature review that I undertook, which was to explore what evidence there is about successful and effective engagement with Indigenous communities. And I want to emphasise it was a literature review task, not original, on-the-ground research. So what did I look for? So I looked in Australia, and I found the most research evidence about this around efforts at engagement at a regional level and in three key sectors: in health, natural resource management and early childhood. I also looked for material about engagement with non-government organisations and companies, although most of it, to be honest, is about engagement with governments. I also looked at other settler countries, particularly Canada, the US and New Zealand, as they're often seen as comparable with Australia, although I have to say the legal and policy frameworks are really very different. And I also look rather broadly for research about engagement with marginalised groups and citizen engagement generally. I should just say, oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Ooh, that's it. So I want to say a word about engagement. In a major review of citizen engagement, Holmes defines engagement as a relatively sustained and systematic interaction, an ongoing process which at its best results in joint determination of outcomes and confers legitimacy on them. Well, that's a bit of a mouthful. So I've just said it's a sustained relationship between groups of people working towards shared goals. And there's usually a spectrum of engagement. That idea is very common, with the level of participation of communities in policy or program development ranging from low, receives information, to high, has control. So I think you'll recognise that that there's a range of different ways or different things people are talking about when they talk about engagement there. The research indicates that where problems are complex, so-called wicked problems, which is what we see in Indigenous affairs, then the level of engagement that works best is at that high end of the spectrum. So that people can participate in defining the problem, which is going to be addressed, as well as the solution. So there is some evidence in Indigenous communities in Australia that supports this. However, it's also clear that engaging marginalised communities is not easy. It does seem to me, though, that one of the challenges that we face is that governments are often operating at that lower end of the engagement spectrum, and Indigenous people are wanting engagement at the upper end of the spectrum. And this, I think, is the source of a lot of the difficulties in that engagement process. So, what are some of the factors in engagement? There's a lot, and the paper elaborates on these in more detail, but the history of engagements will affect current efforts. Indigenous people's experiences of engagement with settler society has been a harsh one, and Indigenous distrust of governments and others is therefore understandable. At the same time, Indigenous cultures and cultural practices and forms are very resilient and need to be understood and taken into account. So people continue to assert their cultural identities and may struggle to work cross-culturally with Western systems of governance, where responsibility for bridging that difference usually falls heavily on them. Language is obviously another important factor. It may be because people are being asked to operate in their second, third or even fourth language, English. And even for fluent English speakers, what I call government speak is another language as well. Effective communication is essential to successful engagement, and it requires well-prepared interpreters in the more remote regions and care to ensure that concepts are understood everywhere. Indigenous communities are also very complex places, as many of you would know, with very heterogeneous mixes of people with potentially different identities and interests, sometimes reflected in different organisations and with dispersed leadership. Knowledge of these complexities is important for successful engagement. Engaging through representatives and meetings can be fraught with challenges. Obviously, if you're going to engage, you have to think about the scale of engagement that's appropriate, and here we need to understand the idea of relational autonomy, whereby Indigenous people try to balance the autonomy of small groups with a desire to maintain connections with a wider regional network of relationships. And judgments have to be made about the level of engagement needed for different purposes within that sort of framework. And there may be need for very multi-layered engagement. Now, if engagement is a sustained relationship, then Indigenous people need to have the governance arrangements in place to enable them to collectively engage with governments over a sustained period. And this may require governments, it almost certainly will require governments to invest in the Indigenous governance and management capacities to support those ongoing processes of engagement. Indigenous organisations are obviously the most visible expressions of this governance and can assist people to engage with outsiders. But we need to be sensitive to the challenges and constraints that they face as the intermediaries, balancing different worldviews, different aspirations and expectations. The purpose of the engagement also needs to be very clear, but a most important finding is that the purpose of engagement needs to be related to Indigenous aspirations if it's going to be successful and sustained. And finally, timeframes have to be adequate and responsive and creative in the way people can have input, so using, oral methods and video and so on. And this applies both to policy and to funding issues. I'll just say a quick word about the policy context, although it's changed since I wrote the paper. At the national level, when I wrote the paper, we had the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples as an emerging national voice, and it still is, of course, but following the change of government, we've seen that there's a hand-picked Indigenous Advisory Council rather than the government seeking advice from the National Congress. There have been a multitude of guidelines, largely about how to do a consultation, often as a one-off. And since 2000, we've had a host of different approaches to engagement by the Commonwealth and other jurisdictions. Some of the most recent innovations by state and territories don't have publicly available evaluations, so unfortunately we can't learn from them. Essentially, since ATSIC was abolished about 10 years ago, governments have experimented in a variety of ways to develop sustainable, suitable engagement strategies, and 10 years on they're still experimenting. Finally, it's important to mention that some sorts of engagements, particularly relating to land and cultural heritage, need to take account of the legislative frameworks on native title and or land rights regimes in the different jurisdictions. Now, since Australia has supported the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it's important that we just have a look at the relative clauses in that about engagement, and there they are. So, Indigenous peoples have a right to participate in decision-making through their own representatives and institutions that they determine, and the concept of free, prior and informed consent is at the heart of this. Now, there's no research. I looked for research on how this was being implemented in Australia, and I couldn't find any. So I can't say how much this is actually being used, except to note that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has written it into its own Aboriginal engagement principles. So maybe in the future we can have a look at that. I don't have time today to go into detail about the international evidence. As I said, it is on a very different legislative policy base. But overall, it does reflect engagement on the basis of self-government, treaty or agreement-like relationships, and it emphasises the importance of investing in Indigenous capacity and resources, noting the important role played by First Nations organisations. It also emphasises respect for First Nation values and difference from the settler society, and very early engagement with Aboriginal people, particularly where resource projects are concerned. So, as I mentioned, the literature on engagement is quite strong in relation to various efforts to engage at a regional level, as well as in those sectoral areas of early childhood health and environment. There are some very, very consistent findings across this quite diverse array of studies. I'll focus on the regional ones first. So I looked at 16 reports or studies covering 12 regions, including pretty much each jurisdiction, and they covered a time period from 2000 to last year. There were evaluations of all of the 7 COAG trials. There were 5 different studies of the Murdi-Parki Regional Assembly, including both Aboriginal and bureaucratic perspectives. There were 3 other Western Australian studies, one from here and another from the Northern Territory. And that last one, the Green Island one, I only received as my paper was being finalised, and interestingly it confirmed many of the success factors I'd drawn out of the other studies, so I'll talk about that one in a moment. So what worked? Going the wrong way. Here we go. So it boiled down to leadership, resources, participatory processes and governance and capacity building, and I'm now going to unpack those a bit for you. So let's have a look at leadership. And Fran mentioned the importance of this high-level leadership. So high-level government engagement was evident where there was success within a clear policy framework adaptable for local conditions, which enabled whole-of-government agenda and holistic place-based approaches. Things worked better where there were regionally based senior people with decision-making authority, a high level of negotiation skills, and an ability to listen carefully, that's what Wayne was talking about, listen carefully to what is expressed, with skilled, culturally competent staff capable of building trust and respectful relationships between government, it usually was, and representative community members. Leadership is actually required across all levels, governments and communities, and what's needed where there was success was people on the ground willing to try new approaches to make things work, recognising that one size does not fit all communities, and we're talking about leadership for change, not leadership for power. Moving on to resources, things work better where the partnerships processes, themselves were resourced. So with staff to manage the engagement and follow up the decisions made, where there were resources available to build the partners' capacities and to undertake the programs jointly agreed, and where there were flexible funds for all these purposes. So those were some of the factors in the resource area that contributed to success. There was greater success in terms of participatory processes where communities were setting the agenda, where they were initiating actions and determining priorities, where local solutions were planned collaboratively so that strategies empowered people, and where planning started from the community level upwards to the regions, and there was a level of autonomy for local groups to decide their own priorities and their activities and have a voice in their own development. And picking up on something that Fran said earlier, where there was identification of Aboriginal strengths, where there was, strengths, assets, positives, where leadership capacities and potentials were being developed along the way, and government staff were avoiding negative judgments. As Denise Hagen, who's from Queensland, said, less monitoring and more mentoring. There was clarity about processes and effective communication between partners and within and between agencies. Information sharing was important. Things worked better where there was clarity and agreement about desired outcomes and indicators and well-developed plans to achieve them. And clarity in relation to decision making, who's going to take what action, who's got responsibility. Where there were, the goals that were agreed were achievable, they were realistic, and there was no promising what couldn't be delivered. And then there were longer time frames, so that, as Denise Hagen put it, people work at their own pace and in their own spaces, realising that change is chaotic and emergent. It is not a linear process. Okay. In terms of governance and capacity building, success was greater where people built on existing Indigenous governance structures, mechanisms and processes wherever possible. And in some cases, the Indigenous bodies had evolved over many years and developed their capacities. Where there was support and capacity building for communities and community representatives for their engagement with governments, so that there was ongoing governance development with processes and structures designed by Aboriginal people and viewed by them as legitimate. And where there was both cultural legitimacy and government funding, both of which seem to be essential requirements to developing a regional Aboriginal governance body with which governments can engage. Now, I'll just look at an example of a regional engagement body that is showing signs of success. And as I said, this is the one that came in right at the end, and so I'd already pulled out all the success factors from the others when I looked at this one. And I wasn't surprised, in a way, that it was successful. So this is a regional partnership agreement that involves 3 partners, the Anandiyakwa Land Council, which is a traditional owner body under the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, the Northern Territory Government, and then FACSIA. And it involved the communities of both the islands. It was a big regional partnership agreement. It involved 10 areas of activity: township leases, planning and infrastructure, housing, health, education, youth and sport, community safety, and so on. And the 10 areas also included leadership and governance and support for the partnership, big tick. The evaluation of the second stage of this RPA was very positive. So what does it suggest were the factors in these positive findings? Now, it says that these can't be attributed to, the success can't be attributed to one factor alone or even several factors in isolation. It was the combination of inputs and processes that determined the overall success. And there they are: the ministerial support from both governments, the community-driven partnership work, the strategic approach that the Land Council took, the community financial contribution, which gave them leverage in the negotiations, so it evened up the power a bit. The funding arrangements and the allocation of funds, which had some flexibility, the positive working relationships, the respect and the trust that was built, and some agreed principles that they worked out at the beginning that underpinned the partnership. There was a strong vision and high-level leadership, and there was also the factor that the region reflected the sort of sense of the place of the community. So it was a natural community, if you like. And there was a lot of attention to effective implementation. It was well supported administratively, and there was attention to good practice and what the evidence said about what worked. What they said needed to be improved is they still needed more integrated plans and pooled funding. They still needed better alignment across governments, and they needed more streamlined and collaborative processes at local level. So although it was going well, things could still be improved. They identified some unique factors, such as the fact that this was one language and cultural group, and the fact that the community was able to commit some of its own resources, but that they concluded that there were a number of other factors that were replicable elsewhere, and there they were. So they said, well, the equality between the partners and the authority to proceed. The community needs and aspirations were the driving force, the agreement by the parties about the objectives and the priorities, the detailed planning and negotiation from the very start, the principles of operation, which were the touchstone for the partnership, good resourcing and a long time frame, and responsive and efficient management. So that just is a case study that illustrates some of the things that do work. Now, what doesn't work? Well, there were things to do with government arrangements, to do with community capacities, and to do with relationships between them that didn't work. So just quickly, because I don't want to focus too much on these, but it's important to know what isn't working as well as what is. So things didn't work so well where different jurisdictions and departments had different priorities and expectations, different levels of commitment, or policy and implementation frameworks that were different, and they never resolved those differences so that they could work effectively in a sort of whole-of-government way. Where things didn't work so well, where high-level goals weren't adequately translated into specific plans and actions with clear responsibilities, or solutions that were designed outside the community were being implemented, or where there were fragmented short-term projects. The question of pilots comes up again there. Things didn't work where the organisational cultures within governments discouraged flexibility and risk-taking, or where more junior government staff tried hard but couldn't make aspirations happen. They were too junior. And where there was insufficient focus on relationship building, too much turnover of key personnel, both in government and community, or fly-in, fly-out services without time to build relationships, and where there wasn't the streamlined and flexible funding. In terms of community capacities, where things didn't work so well, where communities had a weaker capacity to engage with government, or were cynical about government's ability to change, and where there was little government support for the necessary community capacity building. Or where there were problems in the community with their own community-level governance, and that impeded community leaders' ability to engage effectively with governments. In terms of relationships, engagement wasn't so successful where there was insufficient participation and shared ownership by Indigenous people in decision-making, governance and accountability, where there weren't clearly and genuinely shared objectives or agreed performance indicators or benchmarks, and where there wasn't shared access to local level data for monitoring and evaluation, and this is a common problem. And government agencies were weren't clear about roles and responsibilities in partnership arrangements, or didn't follow processes that they'd agreed to follow, or where government limitations and parameters weren't made clear to Indigenous partners from the outset. All right, moving on to the sectoral findings, and I'll be very brief with this, because there were many similarities across 12 health, 9 early childhood, 14 NRM studies, and 3 case studies of engagement with NGOs. And really you could summarise it down to those 5 things. The long-term relationships based on trust, working within a framework of Aboriginal-driven decision-making, some called it self-determination, where power inequalities were addressed with very strong mutual accountabilities, where there were culturally competent staff, and where there was shared responsibility and accountability for shared objectives. So it starts to get a bit repetitive, doesn't it? Let me give you an example of one that didn't work awfully well in the NRM sector, just to balance up the good ones. So it was a study of engagement in coastal zone planning, actually in central Queensland. And there are some of the barriers to Indigenous engagement that this study identified. So the lack of financial and technical resources, people being required to sit in meetings unpaid when everybody else is being paid, people being required to go to bureaucratic meetings with set agendas and look at particularly country issues to do with their land and sea through a Western lens, people having a low level of confidence that they were going to be listened to or have their knowledge respected, and government agencies failing to acknowledge the diversity among Aboriginal people. And in this particular case study, there were 3 different cultural groups, each with different languages, customs and aspirations. So the result is what Aboriginal people perceive to be tokenistic consultation and the disparity of resources, which weakens their commitment to participation. The researchers suggested some ways of... Sorry, I'm really not doing very well with this thing. There we go. Some of the solutions to a situation like this. And they said, well, Aboriginal people should be setting the agenda, making sure all the interests are represented. There should be capacity building and support for Aboriginal involvement, modification of processes and structures. Most of the good NRM studies actually do all their consultations out on country, not in bureaucratic offices. Cultural awareness training for government about how to do business with Aboriginal people and how they view the coastal environment in a holistic way, and ensuring Aboriginal specific views are respected, recorded, and investing in relationships and communication based very much on equality, openness and respect for each other's values, and supporting the development of Aboriginal governance structures. And in this case, an Elders Committee was later formed and started to facilitate Aboriginal people's engagement. And that started to challenge the power inequalities. So just to wrap up, it comes down to relationships, participatory processes, and governance and leadership. So I'm just going to go through these very quickly because this is just repeating really what I've said. But bringing all of that together, relationships that recognise and respond to the context, the history, the social dynamics, valuing the skills and knowledge in that community, clarity about the purpose and scale of engagement, and relating to Indigenous concepts of well-being and their aspirations, not simply the COAG targets. Developing long-term relationships which can help build trust and respect and honesty, good communication, building that effective governance and capacity, both sides, and appropriate timeframes. Sorry. Participatory processes, just summing up. So Indigenous agency and decision-making from the outset, a process that's driven by Indigenous people with government in the role of facilitator, enabler, not doer, building on existing governance structures, Indigenous strengths and assets, and empowering Indigenous people with small wins along the way towards mutually agreed longer-term goals. That's very important in building that trust Oh dear. Recognition of power inequalities, sincere attempts to share power, and one way of doing that is through written agreements, transparency of decision-making processes, and conflict resolution mechanisms that are agreed in advance before the conflict erupts, strong mutual accountability relationships in those agreements, a high degree of clarity about desired outcomes and indicators, and that takes time, and clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and joint monitoring and evaluation to meet the rights and the needs of everyone. And finally, on governance and leadership, obviously you need those governance arrangements in the Indigenous communities. You need strong and strategic Indigenous leadership, which is resourced to do the engagement. You need high-level leadership in governments and flexible but secure and adequate resources to do the work that you're setting out to do. Honesty about the resource limitations so that goals that are set are achievable, and the culturally competent staff who are able to build trusting relationships. Investment in strengthening the governance of both sides for effective partnership working. Building on existing community organisations and governance structures wherever you can, and responding to Indigenous priorities with pooled and flexible funding arrangements. If you can do all that, you're well away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hunt, and I might ask you to come back up. For questions, we have about 20 minutes available for questions. That presentation hit a lot of buttons for me, Dr. Hunt. And I might point out, if it's accurate, that this, what you've said, would apply equally to regional and discrete Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities as it does to our urban communities. And now open it up to questions.
Thank you. It's gone quiet.
Don't be shy.
Okay, well, I'll start you off.
Thank you, Monique.
It's always easier when someone asks a stupid question to ask a more intelligent one later. I think my question is this question of building relationships. Seems to me that the reality in most institutions like the government and the big NGOs is that they really can't guarantee that the person who they're putting in charge of this thing is going to be the person who's going to go to Doomadgee regularly for the next 2 years, in fact, preferably 5 years. And particularly with not smoking, you no longer have the standing around smoking together, which was a really, really important, because I don't smoke, and I really noticed how difficult it made it for me to hang out. And you can't go somewhere and say, I want to build a relationship with you. I mean, for God's sake, it doesn't work. And that seems to me the big problem. And what we need to find is some way of doing some easy thing together, that while you're doing it, then you build the relationship. But sitting around in meetings and, you know, asking and even saying to a community, what does your leadership want us to do? I don't see how it works. So I'm looking for the getting into all the good things that you described.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the literature gave a lot of advice on, you know, how do you build those good relationships. And I don't necessarily think that duration is the only quality. There's got to be a number of qualities in the person building the relationships and in the system that's backing them up, so that they can start to deliver small things, which in itself helps build the relationship. But I think one of the most important things is probably do it in an Aboriginal space. Don't do it in a government space. So the NRM environment ones in particular emphasise doing things on country. If you're going to do consultation with Aboriginal people, and do it in their way, do it in their time frame, don't kind of rush it. Hang out a bit, have a bit of informal time. There was reference in one of the studies to, throw on a barbecue, but there's a certain level of cynicism as well among Aboriginal communities that, they're just going to throw on another barbecue, So, so I think it's got to be very authentic, and it's got to be. I think the most important thing is to do it in an Aboriginal space. And obviously, you can't just walk into an Aboriginal space always, but you've got to start to build a relationship that will help you access an Aboriginal space that's appropriate according to the particular task. So, it might just be a bush meeting, it might be going into a health centre and having conversations there in a community-controlled health centre. It's those sorts of things, rather than inviting Aboriginal people into government offices and so on. It certainly works better, but it's also about listening, leaving your ego at the door, and really going in with a level of humility and a willingness to listen, and not just listen to the first things, but listen deeply, listen over time. I think those are some of the things that might help build relationships, but there's not a lot of evidence in the literature about exactly how do you start to build a good relationship. Not that I didn't look at that in great detail, but I didn't find anything in those studies that really would give you a very practical start on that. Yeah.
While the mic is making its way down to the front, I might just mention from a government point of view, I've been involved in a large number of very bad engagement processes, but a few very good ones, and one of the best ones that I had some involvement in was led by Dr. Cole Dillon, who many of you might know. He was the most senior Indigenous police officer in Queensland, a very honourable person, and he led the engagement for the first review of the alcohol management plans in Queensland a year after that started to be introduced. Very, very difficult engagement process given the hype and the sensitivity around those reforms, but his approach was to go into those communities, stay there for at least a week, and come back at some time in the future and stay there for at least a week, but not to have any structured meetings, but rather to sit down in a place where people gather, and that might be under a tree or in a park, in a community, and have people come to him, and then recorded in an appropriate way what they told him. So it was more anecdotal than anything else. Didn't go down well with everyone in government, but I think the information that we got back from those consultations was extremely rich and worthwhile.
Hi, I'm Keely. I'm just wondering, personally, from a personal perspective, I think that there can never be a relationship between government and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people without the acknowledgement of our own cultural ways of doing, our own laws, our own customs, our own ways of doing things, where there's a lot of mainstream white Australian ways of doing and stuff like that, and it is about being authentic. And when you get on country, take your shoes off, go and sit with elders, go and do stuff like that. And I think without that acknowledgement from white power friggin' people, sorry, don't even get me started, but yeah, without that, I don't think that the relationship is that the foundations need to be made before any of this can happen, and I think that's where we need to start before anything else can happen with our mob. So, yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I'll take that as a comment. I couldn't agree more, and I think what tends to happen from governments is they kind of rush in. They've got a consultation about X, Y, Z. We want your answer today. And we'll go back to Brisbane or Canberra or wherever. And that's not the way to do it.
Make a comment. I just wanted to say I don't think it's only governments. I think
No, it's not.
a lot of agencies
Yeah.
fall into that and
Yeah.
following following on from what the last said, I think it's extremely important to acknowledge that you're not someone else's country, and as you already alluded to make sure you really know who is in the community, what the level of responsibility that each individual holds in the community, and speak to the right person is very important.
Absolutely.
And be absolutely respectful.
Absolutely. Yep. And I think also, you know, the points that Fran made earlier about the impact of all this colonisation and trauma and grief and so on. Be aware of that, you know. Understand that people are still dealing with that. Be gentle, yeah?
Little phrase, right people, right place,
Right,
time.
exactly.
It's useful.
Yep.
Hey, my name's Vinny, a student from USC. I was just based off what Keely was saying. There is going out in the country, there's acknowledging the traditional culture, but wouldn't it be more appropriate to challenge the structures? For example, you can send someone out there and they can do everything appropriately, but when they go back to their government structure, what's going to change when only one person knows how to be appropriate but everyone else disagrees?
That's the thing. That's the point I was making, that the system behind that person that goes out, that meets up with you or whoever, that system has got to support that whole approach to engagement. And I think Fran said it as well. It's got to be an institution-wide commitment to proper engagement and to acknowledging that there have to be different ways of working, and not assuming that, you know, our kind of Western bureaucratic ways are the only way to do anything. They're absolutely not. They're a particular way of doing things, but they're not the way that's necessarily going to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So, yeah, absolutely. You're quite right. You know, one really great person, and some of the research showed that there might have been a sort of relatively junior person who was trying really hard and probably had a great relationship, but he or she was unable to bring the system with them, and so that didn't work. And probably everybody got very cynical as a result of that, no doubt, and pretty burnt by the experience.
Just following on from that, in your opinion, Janet, and this might be for Fran as well, how far away are we from actually changing the institution and the structures? Because this is all really good and we all know this, but I struggle to see any real changes or any implementations of any of these recommendations or research.
Well, my colleague and I, Di Smith and I, who worked a lot on the governance project, started talking about the governance gap when the Closing the Gap thing came in. And it's, you know, unless we get the governance sorted out, both on the ground, Indigenous governance, and so Indigenous people get that sorted out among themselves, and then governments improve their own governance arrangements, then a lot of these Closing the Gap things are not likely to succeed or sustain. So, so I think we're a long way from closing the governance gap, and I think the governance gap is the most critical gap of them all. And there is still, I'm afraid, not acknowledgement of that in most policy circles that I'm aware of. So I think it's, you know, it's a real challenge. And I think partly, and in fact we're moving in terms of kind of more mainstreaming approaches. And whilst I think mainstream departments have to be much more culturally inclusive, I don't think that that's necessarily the best way to work with Aboriginal communities. I think Indigenous-driven, Indigenous-controlled approaches are, you know, demonstrated to work. And that's what we should be doing. So we should see it as a partnership, and I don't think that that's how it's viewed. You know, Indigenous people are just one lot of marginalised people along with kind of, you know, new migrants, refugees and all the rest of it. And we try and deliver programs to them as citizens like all the rest. Aboriginal people don't see themselves like that, and nor should they. So I think what we know from international studies and from studies here is that when Aboriginal people have more control of the agenda, and drive what's going to happen, obviously in partnership with governments and NGOs and companies and the rest of it, but they have to have a much stronger say in things than they do at the moment. And they only can do that if they have legitimate and accepted governance arrangements within their own communities. So until we get that sorted out, I don't think we're going to make the kind of progress we could make with the resources that we have. And that's unfortunate, because it means we're not using the resources as effectively as we could.
My name is Jill Lang. I'm just interested in Wayne's response to the same question, which might be a bit unfair, but I think it's not just governance within communities, it's certainly governments at the state government level that's sorely lacking, and the sort of respect that is needed, but also the responsiveness that's needed in a whole of government way. Yeah.
Thanks, Jill. Perhaps I can talk from a personal perspective and keeping within the code of conduct of the public service. I think if we're talking about the discrete Indigenous communities, and I know we're not for across this whole panel session, but the discrete communities in Queensland are in the most part local governments or shire councils in their own right. One issue I think we have is that we then rely on those councils or the mayors or the CEOs of those councils to be the voice of the community, when actually they're not. They are to an extent because they're elected into a role, but they're elected into a local government role. It doesn't mean they necessarily represent all the cultural and other aspects of that community that need to be taken into account by government or others when determining policy or program development. Very important part of it, but perhaps not the sole voice. I think we also put a lot on those councils that we don't put on shire councils anywhere else in Queensland. We really expect them to solve every issue in that community, and we expect them to contribute far more than we would for others. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing is, again, from a personal point of view, I truly believe that people in a small community, it might be 300 or 400, in one community I'm thinking of, or it might be 1,000 or 3,000 people. It's a small community in Queensland. What other voice do they have outside that community to add support to the arguments that they're putting? And when you are consulting with a community, maybe of 300 people, how do we ensure that their voice is given significant coverage or meaning when you're then taking the results of the consultation or engagement with that community back into a government context, which might then mean briefing a Director General, or in previous department I think there were 7 reports between me and the Director General, so even getting up to the Director General was an issue, but then going from the Director General to the Minister and the Minister to the Cabinet table for a significant decision to be made. How strong is that voice all the way through that process? And I think that's something that we need to look at, and I think the work that Janet and others have done will contribute to that. Again, I think the best thing coming out of these type of publications is that we've now got a peer-reviewed evidence document that we can take to our reports and say, well, this is the way that we really should be engaging with those communities to ensure that we're getting the best possible outcome for the people in those communities. Because to date, and I'm not saying it's always to date, but generally to date, we haven't had a strong evidence base that we can refer to. A lot of it's been anecdotal or little bits and pieces in the academic field that hasn't been brought together. So I think the great benefit of the Clearinghouse is that we've now got a body of evidence. Whether or not it grows will depend on budgets and other things, but we've got a body of evidence that all of us can link into and say, hey, This is the way we should be doing this for a better result.
If I can just add, I mean, there's so many studies that look at the enormous number of small funding buckets and constant turnover of constant having to grant win in order to sustain programs, and the huge number of different pools of funding that people have to draw on in order to achieve what they want to achieve. And there's definitely, major problems in governance that people are having to deal with. So if governments aren't pulling it together, people on the ground are trying to pull it together, but it's very difficult for them.
Any last minute quick questions? One over here.
Yeah, just on that point, in terms of the recent changes to Indigenous policy, the rolling in of all those programs for 5 areas, there was an article on the front page of the Australian today quoting Warren Mundine. I don't know if you've...
I had a quick skim of that.
Seen it, if you have any comment on that. And also just in terms of what you were just saying, putting some of the funding or efficiencies and the cuts aside, what are your thoughts on this general policy direction in terms of, one of the benefits from what you presented here today might be that it actually makes engagement easier in some respects.
Yes.
Rather than having 50 people in 50 different programs trying to engage community, maybe there will be, singular leadership in each of those areas. I'm not sure. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know much about how they plan to implement those 5, but in principle, the idea of having 5 broad streams rather than 150 is a good one. That's a good principle. Obviously, if you do it in the midst of cuts, that's not such a good thing. And how they're going to do it, I don't know. I mean, one of the areas that I'm a little concerned about, for example, is the Indigenous Protected Area program, which has moved in, and that's an incredibly successful program. And I'm worried that because it's going in with work and employment, that it will become just another kind of Western employment program, a ranger program, but with a very different emphasis from the one it's had. It's been funded out of the Environment Department, very much under the radar in a way. And it's been incredibly successful. So I worry that the shift of that one into kind of a grouping which is also with employment will mean it moves into being a kind of more Western employment outcomes rather than what Aboriginal people wanted, a managing country program, which is a very different thing, which gave them employment, but it's a different approach to it. So, how they work out the arrangements for these 5 areas is going to be very critical to whether it's... But in principle, yes, it's the sort of thing we've been arguing for years. So in principle, it's a good thing. In practice, we'll just have to wait and see how it pans out, and certainly trying to do it with cuts is not a good thing. There's no argument for cuts, I don't think.
Thank you all very much for your participation today. I'd like to thank Songwoman Marucci for her welcome to country. I'd like to thank Professor Baum and Dr. Hunt, and also to Helen Johnson and the Clearinghouse for organising this event today. I understand copies of both papers are outside if people haven't collected them already. Could you please join me in thanking all the people that I've just mentioned.